Chapter 6. I'll take that bet. It was hard to sit through normal classes while Midoriya was off proving himself. Hitoshi hadn't thought it would be this hard. He sat at his desk, alternately trying to pay attention and gazing out the window, wondering how it was going. Midoriya's desk sat empty beside his, as though a space in the shape of his friend had been carved out into his life, and now stood hollow. He wondered if someone else would take that desk when Midoriya transferred, and who that someone would be. He had just decided that it would probably be some unfortunate member of the support course, who'd he'd then have to deal with until his own transfer, when a loud, blaring alarm cut through his thoughts. Level 5 security breach, came a voice, measured by urgent, over the PA system. All faculty are summoned to the USJ immediately. All students are dismissed. The USJ? But that was where Midoriya was. What kind of security breach was there? What kind of situation could require every single pro hero on campus at once to deal with? Surely nothing could be so bad as to really need that many pros. They were just being overly cautious, right? The message repeated, but before it had even finished its first run through, students were talking over it, turning in their seats to face one another. Didn't we just have a security breach? Asked a boy 2 rows in front of Hitoshi. Is security here really that bad? Demanded a girl near the front. Maybe it's just the press again, suggested someone who Hitoshi couldn't see in the opposite corner of the room. That was a level 3 breach, pointed out the girl. This is a level 5. Hitoshi ignored them all and raised his hand. Sensei, what's going on? He called over the crowd and the alarm, without waiting to be called on. Class dismissed was the only answer he got. Everyone collect your things and go home, now. The rest of the class began to pack up at once, ignoring the alarm blaring overhead as their teacher bolted outside the room. Hitoshi watched him go with a sense of deep unease. His gut twisted, making him want to puke, and his fingers shook as he packed his things with methodical slowness. His extremities felt extremely cold. The alarm barely registered to him as he filed outside with the others. He felt curiously insulated from both it and the crowd around him. Once he was outside, it was quieter, but he didn't join the throng heading to the main gate, leaving it even further behind. Instead, he stopped to one side of the main stairs, sheltered behind the low wall flanking them, and waited. The staff, all the non-heroes who worked at the UA, were shepherding students out and away from the school, but he ducked down when one of them looked at him. He wasn't going anywhere without some answers. Hey, said a voice behind him, startling him as he risked a peek behind the wall. What the hell, he cried, the sound only covered by the loudness of the alarm, and whirled around to see Hatsume crouching beside him. Did Midoriya come back yet? She asked, urgently, apparently uncaring that she managed to surprise him. No, Hitoshi shook his head. He's still at the USJ, where the security breach is. Did your teacher tell you anything? Hatsume demanded, and Hitoshi was surprised to see she actually looked pretty worried. She hadn't previously struck him as the type to get nervous or anything. She seemed more of a woman of action. Nothing, Hitoshi informed her, watching as her look of anxiety deepened. I don't know what to do. I'm not leaving until I find what happened to him. Do you have his number? Hatsume asked. Call him, or text him, something. Hitoshi took out his phone, intent on doing just that. Then he suddenly paused. If there was a security breach as serious as the alarm made it sound, then there might be something or someone genuinely dangerous at the USJ. If so, it would probably be Midoriya's best bet to hide. What if his phone wasn't on silent? Would the sound of it going off alert someone to his presence? I don't know. Hitoshi looked at his phone. His fingers clenched, white-knuckled around it. I don't know. Hey, said Hatsume, taking Hitoshi abruptly by the shoulders. Midoriya's clever. He'll keep himself out of trouble. I know it, and he'll come back here when it's over. We just have to wait for him. Right, said Hitoshi, and took a deep breath to steady his nerves. It felt like a good plan to have. We just have to wait. After about half an hour, when all of the other students were well off campus, the alarm stopped going off. Its sudden absence was nearly as jarring as its sudden presence. Hitoshi wondered if that meant that whatever was going on was over, or if it just stopped because there was no one left to hear it. Eventually, he and Hatsume deemed it safe to come out from behind the wall and sit on the stairs. No one came to shoo them off, so they stayed there, talking quietly together. Hatsume didn't seem capable of shutting up, and Hitoshi had to admit that the small part of him that wasn't dying with worry appreciated the fact that she was willing to talk to him. So few people had when, in the past. Hours passed, until the sun was low on the horizon, and the sky was hazy orange. Hitoshi agonized again and again over whether or not to call or text Midoriya. It had to be over by now, didn't it? The teachers had left ages ago. Surely it wouldn't take this many pros so long to deal with security breach. What if Midoriya had gone straight home from the USJ, or some alternate form of transportation had been arranged? Or maybe something happened to him, supplied an uncharitable part of his brain. Shut up, Hitoshi whispered to himself, low enough that Hatsume couldn't hear. It didn't help. The sun had nearly gone down, purple twilight settling over the front steps of UA, when suddenly Hitoshi heard another alarm. It was distant, coming from behind the gates, but it seemed to be getting closer. Eventually, Hitoshi identified it as not an alarm, but a siren, an ambulance siren. He and Hatsume stood up as the gates parted to admit the ambulance. Hitoshi's heart was lead as he watched it pull up, and Hatsume had to tug him out of the way as it approached the steps. They stood watching, silent and transfixed. As the doors opened and a few paramedics jumped out, one of them began unfolding a ramp from the back of the ambulance, but Hitoshi could remain there no longer. Please, he said, taking a few shaky steps towards the man. Is there a boy in here, with green hair? He's my friend. Is he okay? The paramedic shook his head, and a spike of terror shot through Hitoshi. Which of his questions had he been answering? That there wasn't a boy with green hair? Or he wasn't okay? He had to be okay. He wasn't dead, at least, otherwise they wouldn't have had the siren on. Hitoshi's questions were all answered when the stretcher pulled out. Strapped down and covered in a blanket, looking unsettlingly pale and drawn, was a girl with short brown hair. He knew it wasn't particularly becoming of him, given that she was still obviously injured, but he couldn't help the relief that spread through him. Behind him, he heard Hatsume release a breath. Apparently, she didn't have any more decency than him. Where are the rest of the students? Hitoshi asked the paramedic, but he was already lifting one end of the stretcher and preparing to carry it up the stairs. Hatsume put a hand on Hitoshi's shoulder and pulled him back, and they resumed their position on the stairs. Now that Hitoshi knew that something dire had indeed happened, he found it even harder not to worry. It had to be over. If they were sending people away in ambulances, didn't it? Surely he was safe to call Midoriya now. He hadn't quite managed to convince himself of this, when suddenly Hatsume shoved at his shoulder to get his attention. He looked up, to see her pointing at the gate, where 2 buses were currently being admitted. The 2 of them ran forward again, as the first one stopped and began discharging its students. Some of the hero students looked at them curiously, but Hitoshi didn't care about them, as he watched more and more people get off the bus. He felt like he was about to vibrate out of his skin as he watched a boy in plate armor come out, followed by a girl with long fleshy wires dangling from her ears, and then suddenly Midoriya was coming into view on the stairs. He was just turning away from the person behind him, his eyes going to the ambulance, as he stepped onto solid ground. Hitoshi didn't think. He immediately ran forward, and didn't go so much as to collide with Midoriya, catching the smaller boy in his arms and hugging him tight. Mido, he cried, squeezing so vigorously Midoriya was nearly lifted off his feet. Shin-chan, Midoriya replied, sounding surprised and oddly out of breath. Are you okay? Hitoshi demanded, pulling away from Midoriya, to hold him at arm's length and give him a quick once-over. The heroes all left, and we were told just to go home, but they didn't give us any information about what happened. And then an ambulance arrived, and oh my god, is that blood! There was, in fact, blood on Midoriya's jacket, staining the edges of 3 large slashes like claw marks in the fabric. It wasn't a lot. Clearly he hadn't read that much, but the sight of the dark stains made Hitoshi's heart clench painfully anyway. He turned Midoriya to the side and pulled up his shirt and jacket, to find a large pad of gauze taped over the area beneath the slash marks. "I'm fine," Midoriya insisted, as Hitoshi examined him. "The cuts aren't deep. What are you doing here?" Hitoshi looked at him, eyes wide and blinking rapidly. He opened his mouth to ask, to demand Midoriya to tell him why they wouldn't be here, why they wouldn't have waited for him. But before he could speak, suddenly, something over Midoriya's shoulder caught his attention. Students were getting off the bus, most of them glancing at the scene they were making without pausing, but one boy had stepped off to one side and stopped. He had a very strange appearance, with half of his hair red and the other white, one gray eye and one blue, and a prominent burn mark across half his face. He was staring at Midoriya with an unreadable expression. Hitoshi met his eye, his grip on Midoriya tightening. "Waiting for you, Green Bean," said Hatsume, covering Hitoshi's distraction. "You didn't think we would just leave without making sure you were all right, did you?" "I hadn't thought about it," Midoriya replied, making Hitoshi turn back to him. It was just like Midoriya to honestly not have considered that anyone would wait for him. "What happened?" Hitoshi asked. He found that he had to fight the urge to touch Midoriya's hair, to brush some of it out of his face, even though it wasn't long enough to hang in his eyes. "We got attacked by a bunch of villains," said a new voice, striking Hitoshi with how strange and chipper it was. He looked up to see a boy with spiky red hair and no shirt on the stairs of the bus behind Midoriya. He was smiling with a mouthful of very sharp teeth, and he didn't look all that worse for wear at being caught in such an attack. Immediately, Hitoshi went on the defensive. Did he think this was some kind of game? Someone had gotten hurt. Was this playtime for him, when civilians were coming away with bloodshed? Abruptly, Midoriya took Hitoshi by the arm and towed him back towards Hatsume, letting the sharp-toothed boy step off the bus. Behind him came a girl with pink skin, and two small horns amid her equally pink hair. Hitoshi regarded both of them with suspicion. Then suddenly he remembered the boy with the two-toned hair. He looked back, but the boy was gone. "Who are your friends, Midoriya?" asked the pink girl. Inexplicably, this made Hitoshi's skin crawl. But Midoriya was gripping him tightly by the arm, so he swallowed his indignation. "Oh," Midoriya gasped, as though he only just realized that he would be called upon to give instructions. "These are my friends, Hitoshi Shinzu from Jet Ed with me, and Mei Hatsume, of the support course." Hatsume gave a little wave. Hitoshi, still feeling supremely uncomfortable, nodded slightly. Neither of the hero students seemed to find this odd, and simply smiled back cheerfully. "Guys, this is Mina Ashido and Eijiro Kirishima, and Tsuyu Asui," Midoriya finished, as the girl with enormous eyes and her tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth joined the little group. "Call me Tsu," she instructed politely. Midoriya paused, as though unsure how to name the relationship between himself and the hero students. At last he settled on, "They've been very nice to me." "Neat goggles," Hatsume said, looking interestingly at the pair of almost frog-like goggles atop Asui's head. She did not seem to be all that wary of the hero students, but Hitoshi still felt like they were being far too casual about this whole thing. The red-haired boy, Kirishima, turned to him. "You should be proud of your friend," he said, showing off his teeth in a bright, if slightly intimidating smile. "He was super brave. He stayed to help us, and he probably got all of us out there alive," Ashido chimed in, with what Hitoshi would almost consider appropriate sheepishness. "It was really impressive, Ribbit," said Asui, doing nothing to decrease Hitoshi's impression of the frog. Hitoshi took a deep, careful breath. He still didn't quite like the way the hero students were in such good spirits after a near-death experience, especially one from which not everyone had come away unscathed. Still, they at least seemed to appreciate Midoriya, and acknowledge how impressive Hitoshi's friend really was. And if they had been willing to sweep his injury and his contribution under the rug, Hitoshi didn't think he could have avoided taking a swing at one of them. At last, Hitoshi put his hands in his pockets, trying to let the hand Midoriya still had gripped around his arm feel him relax a little. "Doesn't surprise me," he said, as nonchalantly as possible. "Mito's just like that." "Am not," said Midoriya quietly, his head ducked down. "R2," said Hitoshi, and was gratified to hear Hatsume's voice in chorus with his own. Midoriya blushed a bit, but said nothing. Ashido smiled benevolently at Midoriya, catching his eye deliberately when he risked a peek upwards. "You sure you don't want someone to walk you home, sweetie?" she asked, and Hitoshi was surprised to find that she didn't sound mocking at all. The offer was apparently genuine. "I can walk Mito home," Hitoshi said before Midoriya could answer. He intended to do anyway, and had texted his mom to make sure she knew he'd be late. Hiroshima looked worried. "But a hero student should," he began, but unexpectedly it was Midoriya who interrupted him. "Shin-chan's going to be a hero student," Midoriya insisted, eyes bright and eager as he talked about Hitoshi. "He's going to get in through the sports festival. He's really skilled and his quirk is—" "Mito," Hitoshi hissed, and Midoriya stopped talking. Hitoshi wasn't sure what expression Midoriya was wearing, as himself was looking determinedly at the ground. His cheeks felt hot. He couldn't remember being talked up by someone important like that by anyone, ever. It felt good, but almost mortifying. There was a pause, and then a hand clapped against Hitoshi's shoulder. "We'll leave it to you then," Kirishima said, making Hitoshi look up into his grinning face. Just like Ashido, there was no trace of mocking, only genuine trust and confidence. Kirishima squeezed Hitoshi's shoulder once, then turned and led the way back inside. Asui followed without comment, and Ashido gave a little wave before going too. Hitoshi stared after them, dumbfounded. Nothing about that encounter had gone the way he predicted. "Hero students are nothing like I imagined," he said, once he, Midoriya, and Hatsume were alone. "Tell me about it," Midoriya sighed. Everyone had the next day off. Even though only one class of hero students had technically been caught in the attack, both hero classes, as well as the support, business, and gen ed courses, were all given some time to recover from the shock. On Wednesday, though, it was back to school, and Izuku met Shinzu at the gate on their way to their normal classroom at the normal time. Apart from the communication that there would be a rest day, Izuku hadn't heard anything from the administration about the test results. "If they don't let you into the support course after that, sue them," Shinzu said menacingly, as they made their way through the halls. "To be fair, I didn't give a lot of performance notes," Izuku defended. He didn't even know what the verdict would be yet, but he was already prepared for the worst. "They wanted you to prove yourself," Shinzu argued. "You've proved yourself a whole hell lot more than you could have asked for. If they deny you on a technicality, I'll fight Principal Nezu myself." "Please don't say things like that," Izuku moaned as they reached the classroom. As soon as they were inside, Izuku found another hall pass being waved in his face. "Midoriya, you're wanted in the principal's office again," said their teacher as Izuku took the piece of paper from him. "Bring your things." Izuku didn't know what "bring your things" meant in terms of his transfer, but Shinzu sent him a grin, so he decided to take it as a good sign. The door to Principal Nezu's office was as big and imposing as ever. Izuku took a deep breath before raising a hand to push it open, but just like last time it opened for him, without him even needing to touch it. Izuku looked in wonderment at the scene beyond, not daring to set foot inside yet. In the office, not only Nezu, sitting in the same chair where he'd been seated last time, but also Eraserhead and President Mike, standing either side of him. They were all looking at Izuku with friendly expressions. Nezu, smug contentness, Eraser, subdued benevolence, and Mike, enthusiastic excitement. Izuku nearly walked inside without taking in the rest of the room, but before he could cross the threshold, he saw there were 2 chairs across from Nezu instead of 1 like last time. One of the chairs were empty. Sitting in the other was Kacchan. As soon as Kacchan's eyes lit on Izuku, they filled with white-hot rage. "Damn nerd, I'll kill you!" he shouted, leaping out of his seat with hands popping like sparklers. But before he could take a single step, suddenly strips of white cloth were wrapping around him, binding him to his chair. "I'd be quiet, if I were you," Eraser said ominously, eyes red as he glared at Kacchan. "You're in trouble enough already." Kacchan growled, but his quirk was useless under Eraser's gaze, and eventually he slouched into the chair as he was released. He turned away from Izuku to face the principal, murderous rage apparently quelled. "What's he doing here?" Kacchan spat. "He's got nothing to do with my attitude or whatever excuse you're finding to get me in trouble." "Midoriya, please come in and sit down," Nezu said, beckoning Izuku inside with one paw. "Oh," Izuku hesitated. "I can come back?" "No, this meeting is about you," said Nezu, still smiling at him. "You're not the one in trouble, little listener," said Mike, flashing a 1,000-watt smile that made Izuku feel just a little bit calmer. On shaky legs, Izuku made his way inside, closing the door behind himself. He sat in the chair beside Kacchan, trying not to look at the other boy, or feel the way that his eyes were burning a hole in the side of his head. "Now, I'm sure you've been awaiting your results of your support course entry exam with bated breath," Nezu said brightly. "Yes, sir," Izuku admitted. It had seemed so natural to speak firmly and clearly when he was in the control room. Here it sounded like his voice was ready to shatter at any moment. "I'm pleased to inform you that you passed," Nezu chirped. "You will, if so desire, be immediately transferred to the support course. Power Loader is very eager to have an analyst in his class. It's been a few years since our last one, and she's gone on a very promising career as performance analyst, working directly for the Hero Public Safety Commission." Izuku's eyes went bright. A performance analyst? He never heard the position, but it sounded just like the kind of thing he was good at. Analyzing heroes was something he was confident in, something he'd practiced. If he could just... However, Nezu's voice cut through Izuku's thoughts. "I would like to offer you a chance at an alternative." "An alternative?" Izuku asked, blankly. He had no idea what kind of alternative could be better than something like that. "Indeed," Nezu said. But there was a strange quality to his voice that made Izuku's heartbeat quicken, as though danger were present. "I'd like to offer you the chance to join the hero course." Izuku blinked. He had to have misheard that. "What?" he asked blankly. Nezu's smile widened. "I told you when we last spoke that I had been hearing about you nonstop from several people I respected," he explained. "I was hearing not only about your intelligence, but your physical abilities, your combat abilities, and your strategic mind. I must say, I was impressed with you long before I saw the videos from USJ attack." "You were?" Izuku asked, his head reeling, his heart threatening to burst. "I was," Nezu confirmed. "In fact, I was so impressed that I had already begun to consider this option before I sent you to the USJ. It was only that your lack of enthusiasm that held me back. But I would be a fool to at least not offer someone with your potential a chance at the hero course." "But I don't have a quirk," Izuku protested, the only thought that would stay together in his head. He couldn't be a hero if he didn't have a quirk. Surely, Nezu was... "Are you fucking kidding me?" exploded Kacchan, abruptly reminding Izuku that he was right beside him. "Deku can't be a hero. He's just a defenseless little weakling. He'd curl up and die if you were fighting against a real hero." "If that is your position, you will be given a chance to prove it," Nezu informed calmly. Both Izuku and Kacchan stared at him. "What the hell?" Kacchan demanded. "I'll prove it right now, just..." "That brings me to the issue of you, Bakugo," Nezu interrupted, and Kacchan fell silent. "I have also been hearing things about you to a degree of regularity over the past few weeks. You seemed, at first glance, to have even more potential than Midoriya, but thus far, your performance in heroics lessons have been very poor indeed." "Not my fault we have to hold back so much," Kacchan argued. "If you let me go all out, I'd show you." "It is your failure to rein yourself in adequately that is hindering you," Nezu countered, with slight emphasis on the word failure that Izuku heard Kacchan growl. "Your refusal to follow instructions, penchant for wanton destruction, consistent brutality against other students, as well as a few other accusations." "That's the kind of stuff D-listers who can't cut it have to worry about," Kacchan protested. "I'm going to be number one. No one will notice any of that stuff about me." "I assure you, they will," Nezu said, and while his demeanor remained calm in the face of Kachan's anger. Izuku could see he was getting a little tired of being interrupted. "Yeah, right," Kachan scoffed, throwing himself against the back of his chair. When it became clear Kachan wasn't going to protest any further, Nezu went on. "Placed in the context of the recent attack on the UA facility, both your situations have been thrown into stark relief. Midoriya, your efforts were instrumental in repelling the attack, and for that we are grateful." "Damn bastard, it didn't even fight any villains," Kachan huffed. But for once he didn't shout. Izuku felt it prudent not to correct him, and instead focused on Nezu's words. "Bakugo, we would never dream of disciplining a student for their behavior under such dire circumstances," Nezu said, voice strangely tight and stiff. "However, the incident has drawn attention to how some of your attitude problems can become exponentially bigger concerns when combined with real danger. I believe I have a solution. If you think this weakling could be ever of any use to me or anyone, you've got another thing," Kachan began at a shout, but fell silent as he was interrupted. "We will hold an official exam match," interjected Nezu, "between Midoriya and Bakugo. The winner will be admitted to the hero course, and the loser will become the member of the Gen Ed course." There was a silence for a moment, and Izuku took advantage of it to try to force the idea through his brain. He could get into the hero course. He had had the chance to get into the hero course. To do it, he'd have to defeat Kachan. He would have to fight Kachan and win. And if he won, and that was the big if, it would ruin Kachan's chances of becoming a hero, or at least set them back significantly. He would be standing in the way of a future hero, a great one at that. But then again, if what Nezu said was true, wasn't Kachan standing in his own way? Izuku reflexively glanced over at Kachan, lost in his own musings, and expected to find Kachan frozen with indignation. Instead, when he turned to the other boy, he found Kachan looking at him, a wide, cruel smile stretching on his face and narrowing his eyes. A shiver ran down Izuku's spine at the look, familiar as it was from their middle school days. It was a look that said that he was in for a world of pain. "Deal," said Kachan, voice low and rough from shouting. "It would be up to you, Midoriya," said Nezu, before Izuku could answer. "You don't have to agree to the arrangement, and indeed you may not want to. I'm not in the habit of allowing students to jump from course to course. If you do this, you forfeit your chance at the support course. If you lose, you go back to Gen Ed." Izuku stared at Nezu, at his calm, friendly smile. He was desperate for a hint on what he should do, but Nezu betrayed nothing. Izuku looked at Eraserhead, but he was still glaring disapprovingly at Kachan, not even paying attention to Izuku or his decision. He glanced over at Present Mike, to find him smiling encouragingly, but with that same deliberateness he'd noticed during their discussion in the gym. And Izuku couldn't pick that apart what it meant. "What's the matter, Deku?" asked Kachan meanly. "Scared?" Of course he was scared. This had to be the biggest decision of his life, something that would alter his future forever. He was supposed to make it right now? He thought of what everyone had said to him over the last week, about how good his analysis was, about how useful it would be to the heroes if he became a professional analyst. He thought about why he started analysis, how badly he'd wanted to be a hero for so long. He thought about how it felt when the doctor told him he would never have a quirk, and how his mother had held him and cried when he said he'd still be a hero. Izuku stood up from his chair, and bent stiffly at the waist in a formal bow. "Principal Nezu," Izuku said slowly, "thank you very much for this opportunity. I agreed to the exam match as a means of testing whether I'm worthy for the hero course. I promise to do my best." He looked up to find Nezu smiling a wide, nearly manic smile. "Excellent." "So when the match gonna be?" Shinzu asked as they did their warm-up stretches. "End of next week," Izuku said, voice strained as he leaned into a particularly hard stretch. His muscles were extremely tense today. We'll do that instead of heroics lesson next Friday. Less than 2 weeks to prepare, Shinzu said grimly. That's not much time. It'll have to be enough, Izuku said, trying to swallow his anxiety. Everything's riding on this. I can't afford to lose. I'm just glad you finally believe in yourself, Shinzu said with a slight laugh. Izuku turned to him mid-stretch. What do you mean, he asked. I hadn't even considered trying for the hero course before now. Exactly, Shinzu interrupted. He stood up from his stretch and looked at Izuku, his gaze warm and fond. Before this, you didn't even think you could try to be a hero. I'm glad you're ready to finally fight for your dream. But the support course, Izuku began, also straightening. But before he could finish, Shinzu was shaking his head. That was never what you wanted, he said. Not really. You were settling. I'm glad you're willing not to settle anymore. Izuku smiled, feeling tears prickling at his eyes. He hadn't needed to tell Shinzu how badly he wanted to be a hero. Shinzu had seen. He noticed, and what was more, he'd even cared to notice. He was willing to support Izuku in chasing that dream, and Izuku was suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude to have such a friend. Thank you, Shin-chan, Izuku said, voice quavering with barely suppressed emotion. He didn't want to start crying now. Shinzu shrugged. It's not a big deal. Izuku opened his mouth to say that it was a big deal, to tell Shinzu how much he appreciated him, when suddenly the door to the gym burst open. Shinzu and Izuku turned to see a whole crowd of people flooding in. It took him a second to register who they were, but then he realized they were all members of Class 1A. In fact, it was most of Class 1A. Midoriya called Araka from the front, waving as she led the parade of students into the gym. Fancy meeting you here. Araka, Izuku called back. You're looking much better today. Did you guys want to use the gym? We can move. No, silly, she said, grinning from ear to ear. We're here to help you train. Izuku stared at her, mouth open. What? We discussed it all as a class, said Ida, stepping forward and adjusting his glasses. We simply decided it's unfair for Bakugo, who's had weeks of hero training and you haven't. And yet you will be expected to compete as equals. You would be at a decided disadvantage going in, so we're here to help you prepare. We're going to give you a crash course in heroics, Kiminari said. Everything we've learned since the beginning of the year. Of course, it would also be unfair for us to help you train while Bakugo trained alone, Ida said, making an odd chopping motion with his hand. So Yaozu and Kirishima have offered kindly to train him while the rest of us train you. I believe this distribution of resources will result in as equal a competition as possible. Are you serious? Izuku asked, his voice high and fragile and his heart swelled with emotion. You really do that for me? Of course, Araka said brightly, giving Izuku a thumbs up. After what you did for us, it's the least we can do. Izuku felt that he had done pretty well to get through the entire USJ incident without crying, in front of any heroes or hero students. This gesture, however, completely obliterated his control. Tears immediately spilled from his eyes, pouring down his cheeks as a tide. His rapid blinking couldn't possibly stem. He wiped at the tears with his bared wrist, then lifted his neck of his shirt and buried his face in it. Once he felt confident enough to speak, he emerged from the safety of his shirt and looked at the collection of hero students. Thank you, he said, voice high and tiny as he tried to keep control of himself. Every single one of you have been so kind to me. I don't know how I could ever repay any of you. Uraraka stepped forward and placed her hand on Izuku's shoulder. Then suddenly her face, recently open and friendly, radiating warmth and optimism, took on a deadly, serious expression. As though a shadow had passed over her, and beneath its darkness she looked as terrifying as any villain. Just beat that punk, she said, voice a low growl. Then suddenly her bright, happy smile was back. Okay? Izuku swallowed. Okay. Nijiro couldn't really blame Yaozu for backing out. When the class decided to help Midoriya train, Ida had agonized over what they could do to make the competition most fair. The rest of the class didn't seem to particularly care what was fair, Beyond that, what they told Yamada-sensei to get him to look in the computer system and find out where Midoriya was training. Ida, however, had worked himself into a lather over it, so Yaoyorozu had suggested that if one of the class representatives trains with Bakugo and one with Midoriya, then it would be as fair as possible. An excellent notion, class president, Ida praised. Just the kind of clever thinking I would expect from our class's elected leader. Of course, if you would prefer to train with Midoriya, I will dutifully train with Bakugo. No, she said. Please, Ida, I know you didn't get too much of a chance to talk to Midoriya that day, and it was something you wanted to do. You go with the group that's going to train with Midoriya, and I'll help Bakugo prepare. You're too kind, Ida said emphatically. I will lead the group that is to train Midoriya with the best of my ability. Now, who would like to come with me? The answer to that question seemed to be the whole class, which presented a new problem for the meticulous Ida. We can't all train with Midoriya, he protested over the rest of the class, all nodded their agreement to each other. It wouldn't be fair. It's not very fair that Bakugo has the class president to train with, but Midoriya has the vice president, pointed out Ishido reasonably. Ida immediately leaned his head against the wall in shame. You're right, he said, in an anguished voice. At the end of the day, I'm only the vice president. It wouldn't be fair to Midoriya. I will train Bakugo. No, Yaoyorozu piped up again, smile taking on a strained quality. I think if Midoriya has more people to train him, then it balances it out perfectly. I'll go with Yaoyorozu, Midoriya volunteered eagerly, but that was immediately overruled by the other girls, and quickly disappeared into the crowd, with Sue's long wrapped tongue around his waist. Ida still looked torn, so Yujiro raised his hand. I'll train with Bakugo, he said cheerfully. Between me and Yaoyorozu, I think we'll do pretty well, and the rest of you can help Midoriya. After a bit more consideration, Ida deemed this an acceptable solution, and the class took off to the gym where Midoriya and his friends from Jet Ed were training. Mineta was nowhere to be seen, so Yujiro assumed it would just be him and Yaoyorozu, but rather than pulling out the gym clothes, she began putting away her things as soon as the rest of the class left. Aren't you going to help Bakugo? Yujiro asked, as she shouldered her bag and stood up from her desk. You can if you want, she said, in a bored-toned voice. I'm going home. But we told Ida. Yujiro trailed off as she gave him a look of condescending. I just said that so Ida would feel better about going to help Midoriya, she said disdainfully. Do you think Bakugo would really thank us if we did offer him to help? He'd probably just blow us up as soon as we talk to him, let alone let us help. Still, it doesn't seem very manly to give him no support at all, Yujiro protested. But even as he said it, he couldn't help but thinking that she was right. She rolled her eyes. Like I said, go if you want. Bakugo was already long gone by the time the others left, and Yamada-sensei had also vanished, so there was no one Yujiro could ask which gym Bakugo was training at. He decided to leave it for the day and try tomorrow, but the next day he got caught up in the excitement of everyone talking about Midoriya's progress that Bakugo slept away again. This time he was able to ask Yamada-sensei to check in which gym he was in, but apparently Bakugo wasn't at a gym, or at least not yet, and then Yamada-sensei had to leave. The next day was Friday, and Yurjo was determined to join Bakugo's training day. He tried to talk to him a few times throughout class, but was always ignored. And by the day's end, he realized he would have to be sneaky about this. When Bakugo left the classroom ahead of everyone else, this time, Yujiro was only a few yards behind him. He followed Bakugo not to a gym, but one of the fake sections of the city that they use for the urban combat training, and he could hear the explosions before he entered the building, where Bakugo was training on the roof. Hey bro, he called, standing prudently by the rooftop door instead of walking immediately up to Bakugo. How's it hanging? Get lost, shitty hair, Bakugo snapped, without even turning around. He had a pile of rocks next to him, and as Yujiro watched him, he picked one up and threw it off the roof, putting a little of his quirk behind it as he did so. It sailed high into the air, coming down somewhere close to the outer wall. Yujiro looked dubiously at the pile. You know, you won't be allowed to bring anything into the arena, right? He said. Midoriya told the others Nezu forbids support items. I don't need a support item to make rubble, Bakugo growled, picking up another rock. "And I sure as hell don't need any help to beat Bakugo." "I just figured you might want a training buddy," Ijiro suggested carefully. "You had to be gentle with Bakugo, as with all live explosives." "I don't need your help," Bakugo snarled, whirling around and throwing the rock in his hand at Ijiro. He hardened just in time. This throw had even more explosive power behind it than the last, and the rock shattered into dust as it hit his skin. "Watch it," Ijiro said wappishly. "You could really hurt someone like that, you know." Bakugo scoffed and turned his back to Ijiro once more. "That's the fucking point, hair for brains." "I'm just trying to help," Ijiro snapped, and then stopped and took a deep breath. He wouldn't get anywhere by shouting. "Look, the entire rest of the class is helping Midoriya. I just figured it'd be a little more fair if you had someone to train with, too." Bakugo picked up another rock and hucked it, screaming, "Die!" as he did, putting still a little bit more of his quirk behind the throw. This time the rock made it all the way out to the outer wall, but bounced off the inside instead of going over. As Ijiro watched the rock fall, Bakugo began to speak. "Deku can have as many unfair advantages as he wants," he spat. "He can train however he wants, whenever he wants, with whoever he wants. It'll make no difference. He's a weakling, a nobody, a pebble in my path to greatness. I'll beat him no matter what, and I'll do so by myself." Ijiro considered this for a moment. He could stay, he supposed. He could stand there arguing until he was blue in the face. He could try to get Bakugo to see the merits of training with others, how much of an advantage Midoriya had and how much of an edge he was turning away. He could just attack Bakugo, like Bakugo had attacked him, and try to force him into a sparring match that way. Or he could do none of that. Instead, he turned and headed back down the stairs, then out of the training grounds and back to the main campus. He walked halfway across the school grounds into an isolated gym the others had mentioned Midoriya was using. Noteworthy only for how little is used by anyone else. He swiped his ID card to get in and walked to the main floor, where the rest of class of 1A was shouting and cheering. For a moment he stood in the doorway watching, the door propped open by his shoulder. Jiro noticed him first, quieting when she saw him standing in the doorway. Besides her, Kaminari turned in when he heard her fall silent, and he too stopped shouting when he noticed Jiro. Silence overtook the class in a slow wave, finally reaching the place of the training mat, where Midoriya and Suro were squaring off. Midoriya looked over only when Suro had already taken his attention off the match. "Kirishima?" he asked tentatively, looking confused. It was clear that the others had told him where Ijiro and Yarazozu were meant to be. Ijiro sighed. "Got room for one more at Midoriya's training?" he asked wearily. The room remained quiet for a moment, and then, from the other side of the training mat, Uraraka jumped a little higher than should be possible, hovering in the air to see above the others. "Of course," she said excitedly. "You want the next spar?" Ijiro gave a tired little smile. "Sure," he said, and came further into the room, letting the door fall close behind him. The hero students were as good as their word, and a week and 2 days passed quicker than Izuku would have thought possible. He would go to class in the Gen Ed course, paying attention as best he could while his mind was on the other side of campus. Then, when the school day was over, he would meet his friends, and he did think he could call them friends now, at their usual gym for his specially formulated workout routine. It was altered somewhat to incorporate their advice, the things they learned about improving certain skills in their heroic class, much of which was things Izuku had figured out himself, but there were a few ideas that came only with this advice, and each time one of the Class 1A mentioned something he hadn't considered, they seemed to glow with pride. "You're pretty clever about training, Midoriya," said Hakare, as he scribbled down notes, mentally making room in his routine for the new information. "It's no wonder you've come so far on your own." "I've just analyzed the moves that were most common in the fighting styles I want to emulate and determined what skills are necessary to pull them off," he said distractedly. It's not hard to isolate the muscle groups you need, and flexibility training is pretty easily as long as you do it consistently. Beyond that, specialty skills just require repetition and persistence. Hakade giggled, and Izuku realized he'd been mumbling. He was about to apologize, but he remembered what Hatsume said about it not being as creepy as he thought, so he swallowed it and returned to assume was her smile. The hero students weren't the only ones helping him train. Shinzu was there every day, listening dutifully to the hero students' input and doing the modified routine along with him. Izuku felt good that Shinzu was able to benefit from this attention as well, and he knew Shinzu was happy for all the help. He'd been a little worried that Shinzu would be uncomfortable with all the hero students around, but Shinzu assured him that this would be good for both of them, and when Izuku thanked him for his help, he smiled so brightly it banished all Izuku's fears. He did sometimes catch his friend shooting strange, unfriendly looks to Araka when he didn't think anyone was looking, but then Shinzu would look at him with that beautiful smile again, and Izuku would get a strange feeling in his stomach that derailed his thoughts entirely. Hatsume also stopped by training a few times. On Izuku's advice, she'd been carrying around a notebook as well, to jot down stray ideas, and she used it to take notes as she watched him spar. She had been particularly disappointed to find out he wasn't allowed to bring support items into his match, but her good spirits had quickly returned with whatever idea had her taking such fervent notes. "What are you writing down?" Izuku asked for the first time, finished about to find her scribbling madly in her notebook. "You'll see," she replied, with that trademark grin of hers. "I can't even have a hint?" Izuku wheeled playfully. It was getting easier to be playful with his friends these days. "When you get into the hero course, I'll show you what I'm working on," she said cryptically, and would say no more than that. They decided early on that the hero students would use their quirks during practice bouts. There was no point in them holding back. Kachan certainly wouldn't. It was good practice in outmaneuvering his opponents, and with each victory he felt less like it was luck and more like he'd been genuinely clever. Still, he had to prepare specifically for a fight with Kachan, and he already knew all about Kachan's quirk. The trick was learning to fight against it, which was easier said than done. None of them had quirks quite as flashy as Kachan's, but Kaminari made getting close to his hands equally unwise, and Ishido had a similar range. The person with the closest quirk to Kachan's was Todoroki, but he mostly hung back. At first, Izuku thought the others might have forced him to come, and he didn't really want to be there. But then he noticed how closely Todoroki was observing, and the frustrated look on his normally stoic face. Clearly, Todoroki was interested. Izuku wasn't sure in what. Again, Izuku noticed Shinzu giving sidelong looks at Todoroki this time, but he said nothing about Todoroki's odd behavior, and Todoroki seemed content not to speak either. Izuku was so caught up in training, and making sure everyone knew he appreciated their efforts, and focusing on how he was going to approach the fight, that for a while he almost forgot to be nervous. As days passed and the match drew nearer, however, the enormity of what he was about to do somehow became more real. A tightness settled around his chest, like a steel band, making it more and more difficult to breathe easily, and it only grew more vice-like when he was alone. In quiet moments, when everyone else had gone, he sometimes felt so oxygen-starved that the room would start to spin. It was during one of those quiet moments that he broke down. It was Thursday, the day before the match, and Izuku was the last out of the gym. He'd gotten that dizzy feeling, as the other boys were changing out of their gym clothes, and he'd had to take a minute to himself before he could follow suit. They were all gone by the time he stepped out of the changing room, but instead of his schoolmates, he found a teacher waiting for him outside. "How's it hanging, little listener?" President Mike greeted, beaming down at Izuku. "Seems like you've been working hard to prep for your big debut." "Yeah," Izuku said wearily. "Everyone's been so great at helping me, but all this training is really wearing me out." "Better make sure you're getting enough rest," Mike warned. "Downtime is important for any hero. You'll have more time to chillax when you aren't rehearsing for a big show." "I guess," said Izuku, trying to muster a little smile for his teacher. Mike's expression changed, though, settling into something gentler, more sympathetic than his usual bright enthusiasm. "It's not just training, though," he surmised. "Worrying takes a lot out of you, too." Izuku looked away, off to one side. Is it that obvious how scared I am? He asked in a small voice. Anyone would be scared, Mike pointed out. You've got a lot riding on this fight. I know, Izuku said, but everyone else seems to be so confident. None of them seem worried that I won't be good enough, or that something will go wrong and they'll lose everything, or... They've already been admitted to the hero course, Mike reminded him. They've had a lifetime of encouragement because of their quirks. I don't imagine you had much encouragement at all. Izuku looked at the floor, then shook his head briefly. He did not want to look at President Mike, as he admitted that his life hadn't exactly been full of people willing to place their confidence in him. A large, warm hand landed on Izuku's shoulder, but still he couldn't bring himself to look up. What's on your mind, little listener? Mike asked softly. Izuku began. And suddenly there they were, the tears he'd been suppressing for days now, flowing from his eyes to drip down his cheeks and onto the floor. He dashed at them with both hands and went on. It's a lot, you know. Everyone has so much faith in me, and it's new, and it feels good, and I don't want it to go away. I just don't want to let anyone down. You won't let us down, little listener, Mike insisted, and then suddenly he was right there, kneeling in front of Izuku, and knocking his hands away from his face, cupping his cheeks and wiping the tears with his thumbs. You couldn't possibly let us down, after everything you've already accomplished. But what if I do? Izuku sobbed, looking up at last into Mike's concerned face. What if I can't do it? The more I think about it, the more I don't think I can, and... You can do it, Mike cut him off. He didn't speak loudly, but his voice was firm, solid as steel, like he was sure as stone of his conclusion. How do you know? Izuku asked desperately. He felt strangely untethered from his body, but Mike's thumb stroking the skin beneath his eyes lessened that feeling. I wouldn't have recommended the match if I didn't believe you could do it, Mike said, smiling down at Izuku with eyes twinkling beneath his shades. Izuku sniffled. Really? He asked shakily. Mike chuckled a little. Really, he confirmed, then rested his forehead against Izuku's. For a moment, Izuku just breathed. The steady pressure of his teacher's head against his own seemed to push down into himself, stopping his mind from carrying away on the breeze. He could smell the leather of Mike's fingerless gloves, and he could hear his steady breathing. He almost thought he could feel his heartbeat through the places they were connected, but he was sure that was just his own. Okay, he breathed, nodding a little, careful not to dislodge anything. Okay, I believe you. Good, said Mike softly, pulling back and giving Izuku one of his rare, genuine smiles. For a second there, I thought I was going to have to call Izawa to knock some sense into you. Izuku giggled wetly. Yeah, he said, nodding in exaggeration agreement. Let's not do that. Finally, Friday arrived, and Izuku walked into his morning class completely on autopilot. His mind was entirely elsewhere, in the training grounds, where they would have the exam fight, and he barely registered his surroundings as he made his way to his desk. It was only when he felt someone tap lightly on the shoulder that he was recalled into himself, and he rolled around to see one of the girls in his class standing beside him. She sat 2 rows away, and she and Izuku had only spoken a few times, but her smile was open and friendly. Hey, she said, with a little nervous wave. Midoriya, right? Yeah, he replied. I think we met on the first day of class. Fujioka, isn't it? Yeah, she said, apparently pleased to be remembered. I just wanted to say, well, that is, some of us had heard. You know about my exam fight today, Izuku guessed. Yeah, Fujioka sighed with relief. Anyway, I just wanted to say good luck. Oh, Izuku gaped for a moment before recovering himself. Thank you, that's really sweet. I heard you don't have a quirk, she went on. Well, neither does my little sister. I just thought, if you win, well, it'd be really something to tell her, you know? Izuku hesitated a moment, then gave her a wide grin. I guess I'll just have to win then. That's the spirit, said a male voice from behind Fujioka, and Izuku looked around her to see a boy he'd never spoken to give him a thumbs up. There was a general murmur from all through the class, and Izuku looked around to see nearly every student in class looking at him. Some were smiling, some giving him looks of fierce determination, and a few were giving him fighting gestures like flexing or punching the air. None of them, however, were giving him looks of scorn, and none of them were laughing at him. Izuku looked over at Shinzu, to see him grinning wide and genuine. He looked back at the class. "Thank you all," he said with a small bow. "I promise to do my best to live up to your expectations." There was a round of cautious, subdued cheering, like celebration of fragile hope, before their teacher walked in and called the class to order.